Welcome to IAC and welcome to Fabla Barcelona. We are delighted to have tonight a very special guest. As you know, most of you might know him, John Thackara. He's named as a philosopher, but he has some other professions that he will share with us. I won't advance so much of that. He's been a writer and an author of many books and many content around the role of design in creating a more ecological model for cities and society. We're going to learn about that as well. We are basically trying, in a way, by connecting with people like John, bringing together the brightest minds in the world at IAC in order to have a different approach in the future of the profession of architects and urbanists and designers, and especially how we start to relate ourselves with technology in a more sustainable way, and in order to create a possible future for most of us. No? So I think that basically is a statement that we are making itself the fact of having the opportunity to discuss and create this kind of debate in this room tonight. Also for you to engage with John in order to create this conversation. Also, after his lecture, you can have access to the book written in Spanish. It's going to be sold in the entrance. And also, just a kindly reminder that next Friday, this Friday, 16th, in the night, we have the open night, which is an amazing event in the whole neighborhood, John. All the creative spaces open their doors. Right now, in this district, we are starting to prototype a model of a fab city, of a productive city, together with the city council, but also with forces that are moving around the old 22-at, now the Poblenou district. So thank you for joining us to have this conversation again, and we hope that this is the beginning of many more. The stage is yours.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So we last met, I think, in Copenhagen a few months ago, when one of the biggest thrills in my life was to go to the lab which was associated with tomorrow's meatball project, which is an IKEA project. IKEA's meat sells more meatballs than most food companies sell food, and they had, I sadly missed the launch of the event, but all over the world people have been asking me, oh yeah, if you go to Copenhagen, please have one of those meatballs, and they're amazing, interesting subject. But I must say that things like meatballs are the kind of subject that, for me, as a non-professional architect, connect me with these very otherwise abstract stories about sustainability or smartness or the future of the city. And in particular, I'm just amazed throughout my life as a writer and a collector of stories by how little cities think deeply about food and where it's coming from and how secure is their source of food. And for the last few years, as the kind of general noise around the future of the city has got louder and louder, and the attention to technology and the attention to financial issues and the attention to new models of development have become more intense and more amplified by the crisis, very bizarrely, the question of the food has not really risen up the agenda very much. But I will do to you what I've done to everybody that I've met in the last period in the city's space, and that's to say, two questions. Do you know where your next meal is coming from, whether it be a meatball or a salad? Question one. And question two, do you know how healthy that place is from which your next meal is coming? And we don't have to have a discussion. I know that you're saying, what a crazy question. I'm an architect or I'm an urban planner. I'm not a cook. I just think that we need to reimagine cities as metabolic and nutrient-rich environments in which, if we are not clear about the security and the resilience of our nutrient sources, then we can be as smart as we will like, but we'll also be dead. So I want to do my talk in 3 bits about why we need a new story to frame the discussions we have about where the city is going. And 2/3 of that story is what I just told you. It's not just about the city, it's about the city as part of a bigger metabolic environment in which the health of the whole system is what really should be preoccupying us. And that's a short bit just to get you provoked. The main part of my talk is that if I can persuade you that what happens outside the city walls, or whatever the modern equivalent is actually worth our involvement and knowledge and participation and design attention, what are the different ways in which we can connect with this place called the countryside or nature or the land? And so there's a whole pile of examples that I will tell you quite quickly, which I think are fun and exciting and turn me on a lot. So I'd be interested to see whether any of you agree with me on that. Lots of different ways in which we could do that. And then thirdly, if we have time, which is always unlikely, I can talk about, or we can do that in the questions, the notions of how do we organize our participation in projects that are scattered around in place and in time, the notion of cooperation platforms as something which are design tasks in themselves. And I'm sure many of you have heard the crescendo of noise about the general issue of cooperation platforms, but certainly in something like a city, and we're just talking upstairs just now, where the number of different people that need to be involved, the different agendas, the different cultures, the different languages, we need to be much more sophisticated and artful in creating ways for these different people to work together. But the first bit I will do, I've now got it down to 2 slides, which is the last 10,000 years of sustainability explained in short. My task by Christmas is to get it down to 1 slide. But basically, the trouble with all of our discussions about cities is that they nearly always miss out an inconvenient historical fact, namely this picture about what development, progress, and modernization has meant through time. On the left, and some of you, I can't actually read, oh, it's 1:45, is a hunter-gatherer in pre-modern times who would need, in round numbers, to get through the day, some food, some shelter, some heat, maybe some clothing, 5,000 kilocalories of resources, generally described. Fast forward through 10,000 years of the birth of civilization, the spread of language, and the invention of architects, and you get to the situation today where the body on your right, climbing up an architectural building in London, needs, roughly speaking, 300,000 calories per body per day, once all the needs of daily life are taken into account. And those are the structures, the lights, the information systems, and all the paraphernalia of the city you see in the background. And that gap between 1 and 60 is actually getting faster, wider, faster as modernization takes hold, despite the crisis, despite all the things that are happening in the last years. So in other words, we have a form of modernization, development, and progress which requires a greater split between the resource requirements of the human beings and the planet that we live on, which is finite. And you may want to share with me the question, is this a wise or even sustainable way to organize the world? I don't think so. And there's the second picture, so that we're not stupid, but we are very cognitively impaired. So the other way to think about those 10,000 years is that through our invention of all sorts of different filters and ways of organizing our understanding of daily life, we have become separated in more and more dimensions from the living systems of which originally we realized we were a part. And so after 10,000 years of progress, we've got it into our minds and our institutions and our economic models that the value of life itself and the economy are 2 separate things. And having achieved that split, that metabolic diversion, we are able to promote the cause of endless growth, endless increases in resource use, because that is good for the economy, which is fine because the economy is separate from life, which is the much quoted metabolic rift, which includes various forms of paraphernalia that you and I find very useful, such as language, science, and culture. So once one is beginning to challenge the notion of the economy as separate from life and from value, we have some adjustments to make. So what we need is a story, a framework, a narrative that to guide our work as designers and creative people, or just regular citizens, a different story in which life itself is at the center of what we do rather than some optional extract on the outside. And when I say story, I almost literally mean a founding story, but just when one begins to do something like design a city or a car or institute a policy or write a book, one thinks, what will the consequence of my action be for life of which I am a part? And that story framework can then not stop us at being active, but can then shape us in terms of the range of choices we then go on to make. Number one, as I said at the beginning with my "Do you know where your lunch is coming from?" we need a story that connects the city and the non-city in a completely natural and systematic and everyday way, not as something which is hard work. So why would we think about the city without thinking about the soils and the rivers and the biodiversities and the forests and the rest? Why would we do that? Well, because we're impaired by the metabolic rift, but that is then the next stage is those are part of the same story as they are with the tree. We need to connect the story of what we're going to do as designers to its consequence for the health of the soils, without which no people, no design, no smartness, no architects, no nothing. If the soils go, we go. And yet that would be, it was news to me 5 years ago. It's a kind of relatively new part of the story that, oh my God, soils are not just like interesting or where you grow potatoes, but they are the largest living system on the planet. Without the soils, we will be finished. And this is where this wonderful metaphor, it's not actually a metaphor, but Paul Stamets, as you may know, invented this concept of nature's internet, which my professional career has been pretty heavily influenced by exploring how amazing man-made internet is, will be, and its consequences for all sorts of things. Never having known until rather recently that under the soils of a healthy field, nature has its own internet connecting plants and minerals and all sorts of things, passing information backwards and forwards, something that other cultures have known all along, but we design people, or we city people, have only recently kind of been reminded by scientists that things are connected under our feet in a way that is incredibly much more sophisticated. 0 server farms, 0 power stations in Iceland, for example. So man's internet and nature's internet, they are part of the same story. How and what the consequences are, I just don't know, but we just need to have that in our minds. We need to stop separating macro and micro in our thinking. I was just talking upstairs about the different fads of diet. I can't remember why I was talking to a wonderful journalist, but the basic story was, do you remember when we had to eat lots of vitamin C and then they discovered that it was bad for us? Despite becoming allegedly smarter about the way the body behaves, we still persist in separating study of the body from study of the city as biochemical, biophysical, bioneurological processes. Simple way to think about it is that walking down the streets of Bangalore, or for that matter, Barcelona, you probably would be exposed to 2,000 different man-made substances and particles, which, because our bodies are porous, would affect our metabolisms and our minds and our behaviors in ways we probably can't begin to understand. But pretending that they're separate subjects for different disciplines is not a wise way to proceed. We're getting a bit buzzwordy here, but in general, figuring out ways to understand and connect social systems and ecological systems in everything that we do as designers. Because when we separate them or regard them as different departments, either of our university or of our city planning, if we don't consider them and embrace them holistically, then we make mistakes in terms of enabling developments to happen that are bad for one or both, or the relationships between them. So where the economy, where ecosystems meet, is something which requires design mindfulness and design attention. we need to think about historical aspects of place as well as biochemical ones and all the other ones I've been mentioned. This is a rather remarkable practice being developed at Schumacher College in England, whose very name will give you the game away. It's called a deep time walk, and it's basically a way to understand how geological forces have shaped the qualities of a place over millions of years, the movement of tectonic plates, the consequences for the different forms of soil formation, the different kinds of agriculture and plant life that have emerged, etc., and along pretty late in the day, as you see on the left, the last tiny bit is, humans on the left there. But just having an understanding about these deep aspects of the shape of the geology itself on the quality of a place is pretty amazing. Now, they are, of course, Schumacher College, very Gaia, but you can shortly get that on as an app on your phone and do a deep time walk in your locality too, just to prove that time doesn't stand still, even for Schumacher. So to conclude, a story that reconnects in thinking about the city and how it should and can evolve with our participation has to have these three things as part of the same story. So it's rather easy for me to put a bunch of beautiful hands by the French artist Céline Boyer making that point. How we do it, of course, is a different matter, but I'm just putting that on the table as, so to speak, the challenge for this evening. One of the answers in terms of how, as a designer, you are supposed to connect social and ecological and economic things, is to change the geography. So I spent the last 3 or 4 years trying to understand from the pioneers of the bioregional movement, which goes back to the 1970s, what does a bioregional space mean in terms of all the different ways of understanding it? It's a complicated story with all these things such as, biodiversity, soils, whatever you can imagine, overlapped with emergence of different forms of economic behavior shaped by that place. To me, I don't understand much of it, but the beauty of a bioregion is it's a subject and a sort of artifact that you can very easily imagine a very diverse group of people saying, yes, we would like our bioregion to be healthier. So I'm putting that on the table basically as part of the answer to the question, how do we have a discussion about the near future, design-wise or policy-wise, where everybody has different agendas. You can't just wish the different agendas away, but what you can do is to seek for some kind of shared space or shared object which we can agree whatever our other differences. And I think a bioregion answers that question. Here's the original one. This is Cascadia, which is northwestern United States, where they've for 35, 40 years now been developing a curriculum for their bioregion, which explicitly makes it possible for planners, architects, designers, economists, and so on, to have a shared conversation about what would be the actions that would leave their bioregion healthier rather than less healthy at the end of a process. So you can check out Cascadia and these other projects, but the main thing to remember that if place is what matters, rather than something abstract like money or GDP or whatever, then the place of the bioregion is big enough to give you the different combinations of social and ecological systems that I'm talking about. And there's my plug for the book. So what I try to do in the book, well, what I do in the book is bring together probably half of the answer to the question that I posed to you at the beginning, namely a new story of space, which is to say quite a large number of stories about individuals and groups and communities in different parts of the world who are attempting to meet their daily life needs in ways that leave their bioregion healthier, their land healthier, their place healthier, and not for very much of the time explicitly doing so in that language, but just that their practices are low resource, low impact, high social content, high degree of creativity in creating institutional forms, and a relatively small amount of attention to heavy technical systems. So the starting point in my work as a writer for the last 5 years is who is doing interesting stuff, food, mobility, clothing, shelter, who is doing interesting stuff that if you add it all together could actually begin to make a parallel or an alternative system that doesn't wreck the place. And having done that, and I really love doing it, and I totally recommend that you do this as a form of therapy, even not as a designer. Go and find people doing projects on the edge of the respectable world to do with food or water or forest or whatever, and I'll show you some, because they are happy people. I just give you this as a fact, rather than stressed out city people. And the point being is they can always, as soon as you meet some of these guys, think, I could suggest all sorts of ways of doing this better or connecting you to something else. And to me, that's the second half, which I didn't do in the book, and if I ever acquire the energy to do another one, I might do that, is how to tie the bits together in such a way that the component parts begin to make a sort of system picture that is a replacement. Which is where I come to Back to the Land 2.0, because in addition to my proposition that we need to think about design in ways that respect social and ecological systems, and where our whole value system is to make them healthier rather than unhealthy, this actually, I think many people have a kind of feeling, or it's in our genes to want to do this kind of work, or just to go and get in touch with the soil or living systems, but it's very hard to do. So for a period I thought I basically am sounding like Mao Zedong. We should close down the architecture schools, close down the universities and the companies, and send everybody to work physically in the fields. I do quite a lot of me still thinks that, to be honest, when I'm feeling that things are getting out of control. But supposing that one does it on a voluntary basis, what I've learned talking to groups like yourselves over this last 3 to 4 years is that a lot of people would like to be connected to land-based projects in many different ways, but cannot find the motivation or the practical means to do so. They're not going to abandon the city and become a serf or a starving farmer just because they feel like it. And I've had to slowly come to respect that point of view. So I've realized that the opportunity for learning by doing is going to be part-time and hybrid modes of reconnecting with the land. So that whatever your work or your practices are, one can imagine that you would maybe find it interesting and fulfilling to have a connection with something land-based or biodiversity-based, but not requiring you to throw this life away and to acquire another life. So I kind of got that story, and I'll just show you some examples about the fun things that I have observed emerging in the last period that are, if you like, hybrid ways of connecting, not just, so to speak, as study, but also forms of business and enterprise, such as learning journeys to learn things in new ways. I just run through some examples. So this is in Slovenia, which, as you all know, is a world headquarters of expertise on honey and beekeeping, which I, of course, didn't know until I went there and discovered there's a bunch of people who will organize journeys for you over days or weeks to visit, frankly, rather strange people in forests with bees, doing all sorts of things with bees and bee products. The point being that you could have a journey through landscapes and learn about practical stuff to do with honey and honey products, and then learn about the land. I can't remember what the precise name of the company is, but it's, if you look up bee journeys, you'll find it. Did I already mention that bee-bred people are happy people? I have a rule, one of my many design laws is that if you make bread or beer, you're probably a happy person. The point being that all over the world, there are incredible multiplicity of bread traditions that we know have been temporarily excluded by the industrial food system, but that they're all coming back. But it's not so easy to figure out from reading books or watching YouTube movies how bread is made in different places. So an architect in Bulgaria actually started the Bread Houses Network as a place to go and spend time with baked bread people, making bread, learning about the different traditions, and it's just a kind of hands-on, mouth-on way of learning about bread. And I'm just telling you, this is a woman I met in Lapland who also, which I must say I thought Lapland was a bit cold for bread, but they grow lots of wheat and make amazing bread in Lapland. But they have long winters, and they spend a lot of their winters teaching each other new techniques and histories about bread in a learning network, which are kind of urban people who are not about to throw everything away and become bakers, but they want to know about it. Some of you may have heard of Deborah Solomon, a friend of mine who's an artist and a food person based in Amsterdam. She takes people to Latvia or strange parts of the world to learn about fermentation. And fermentation comes under the umbrella of bread, beer, and other things, because it's a natural process in which the more you get into it, you think you're just making bread or beer, but actually you're reconnecting with living systems, and has a very, very bizarre form of psychological beneficial effect, which I don't understand. But anyway, you can go, and a friend of mine in Riga also takes people into the forests around Riga, where you can spend days or 2-3 weeks hanging out with people who live in the forest and work on fermentation, 1,001 different techniques and recipes. It's quite mind-blowing, well, not blowing, mind-calming. There are a growing number of so-called learning farms or social farms. So the word social farming, I think, came out of America, but it's basically reconnecting with a rather old idea, which is that farming never was and never will be an activity in which somebody called a farmer sits in a field waiting for the kind of sun to come up, growing food or raising animals. It's always been a hybrid, complex activity in which people from different communities help each other. Anyway, so in Scotland, they have a learning farm where you can go for different periods of the time to learn either a very vertically specialized technique like potatoes, or managing a sort of mixed use and mixed thing farm. And it's just a very good way for people to learn that managing a farm and being a grower or being a husbander or a steward is a complex subject that is not very easily written down in a book. And these are growing like crazy. This is an example of a rural learning activity whose purpose has escaped me after many years, but I just think it's wonderful. So Leandro Pisano runs a festival in southern Italy called Interferenza, where he brings media artists to work with food people. And this woman is doing a sampling of the sound of cheese maturing. And I don't know why she's doing that, and I don't think I have to provide you with an answer to that. I just love the whole idea of it happening, just to demonstrate to you that reconnecting with the land and with food doesn't have to be tramping around in a field with boots. Permaculture design courses. The whole world of permaculture. How many people in this room do not know what the word permaculture means? No, permaculture, what a stupid question. So, permaculture is a body of knowledge and practices about natural ways of designing and growing and living on the land, etc. It's a very complicated but rich and interesting area in which, when you decide to learn more, it's one of the most innovative communities in the world in terms of learning opportunities or traveling to learn things. So there's this group in the Negev desert who have this incredible range of activities to do with how growing and working with desert can bring land back to life in an amazing way. I just met somebody who came back from Myanmar, where they have a very stressed environment, but they have an incredible tradition of schools of horticulture, which are sustainable, which I didn't know at all before. So you could theoretically go to Myanmar and learn about sustainable horticulture. In various places, I never even heard of environmental biogeography before, but it's where you go and help scientists study the history of the land in terms of natural geology as it's been impacted by human settlement and human patterns of production. It's kind of a research activity. The point being, you can go and learn in something like that how in the scientific and research domains very curious combinations of disciplines are coming together in the ecological kind of sense to say, if in order to understand how to inhabit the land in a healthier way, and this includes cities as well as in the countryside, we need strange combinations of disciplines to work together. So that's what they're doing. So that's number one, learning journeys. The point being, you can, for 2, 3, 4 weeks, you can go and study and be somewhere and begin to just get a feeling for how the land works. What can it possibly mean for your work in a city, etc., etc. But that doesn't really answer the bigger question, as I confidently observe happening, more and more people realize that actually the future is not just going to be made in cities, despite all the rhetoric to that effect, but that cities and the rest of the planet's surface and living systems are evolving interactively with each other. We will have to create or find new institutional forms or just new models for doing this on a larger scale, in larger numbers and with more diverse groups of people, which is where the general subject of folk high schools, hubs, fab labs and hives for the countryside, or that are twinned with or connected with things in the city, become very important. And like everything else I've said this evening, or ever will, or ever have said, nothing that needs to be invented from scratch, because throughout history, people have grappled with how you teach people things in periods of rapid and profound change, so that all over the world, people are creating, adapting old institutions and transforming them into new ones. This is near where I live in France, where a former sanitarium and mental hospital economy is going to become a center. I'll show you that as a kind of picture of a beautiful place. The point being that nobody actually has much of a clue what the content of this facility will be. It's just that all over the world, really, people are realizing we need different combinations of skills and practices and traditions than we have in the existing institutions. Denmark has actually a 200-year-old model of institutional connection point called the Folk High School. I don't know if anybody's heard of it. On your left there is one of my heroes called Grundtvig, who in the mid-19th century decided that it was insane that we should teach people how to live in and for and with nature, teaching only by sort of formal and academic and indirect and abstract means. So he set up a series of folk high schools where you could learn a skill, a trade, or some kind of practice that was necessary to live in that place. No exams, no entry requirements, just the willingness to go and learn with your fellow citizens from that place. And amazingly, 80 of these things still exist. So there exist, and all over the world, there are different versions of things that have been forgotten or overlooked or just never thought about by mainstream education, which we can all go and connect with and reinvent and modernize. So I spent 2 years trying to understand the Danish folk high school system until literally about 2 months ago, I discovered that France has a similar thing called the rural family house, which is how in the 19th century France helped rural communities adapt to industrialization, modernization, and the growth of cities. And so all over, certainly where I live in southwest France, you have these buildings, many of them abandoned or only lightly used, which have in their very bones the notion of learning in a place, about a place. And so as far as I'm concerned, we can then start to reinvigorate, reimagine, reinvent the rural school system without inventing new ones. This is in America, where a group called the Food Commons is reinventing barn raising as a knowledge activity. Long story, I don't have time to go into it, but if you look up the Food Commons, you'll see an amazing story about how people who've been struggling for 30 years, 40 years, to sort out the horribly dysfunctional food situation in the US, have realized that they need hubs in each locality, in each region, to bring the different functions together, but also the different groups of people together, either by physically building it, in this case, barn raising, old-fashioned style, or just taking over existing facilities. So the food hub as a knowledge center and a cultural convergence between things that happen in cities, the meatball story, is pretty important. They can be temporary, these hubs. This is something I was associated with in France, where just the simple act of getting a shed and putting into that shed 40, 50 projects from, say, a 50-kilometer radius of people doing projects can be very transformative in and of itself. I need to speed up a bit. farm hack you know about. Well, if you don't know about farm hack, so there's a whole, your makers and fabbers here, so I don't know what I've only been here for a couple of hours, but the point is that making and fabbing has implications outside an urban context for the whole world of small-scale farming, where 1,001 different forms of adaptation and repair need to be done to machines of various kinds, and there's a quite magical and obviously fairly crazy group of people who repair and hack farm equipment, and I thought it was American only, but they've appeared in different parts of Scotland, and maybe they're here in Spain, I don't know. Do you have farm hack here? Does anybody in farm hack? You can be the first farm hack. That can be very valuable. And then so other forms of sort of shared space, so the kind of this, you know more about this than me probably, the notion of the sort of shared workspaces in cities, but they are now cropping up in fairly isolated and peri-urban and rural situations, and the Inspiral network in New Zealand and now in other places is beginning to explicitly target outside city spots, because that's where they reckon the need is for shared connectivity. And then thirdly, when did I start? 1:15, 1:30. So I've finished my time. Okay, 5 minutes. 7:40, can we agree on that? So I've got another 10 minutes. Excellent. I am really bad at telling the time after all this. Anyway, so lots of things going on. Where I started was with the value proposition. What sort of economy is it that destroys the planet in order to grow? Very strange. Take that through as a consequence through all our